Have you ever felt like you're consistently doing things that you're not good at, or that the expectations at your work are just not clear? Or what about you haven't had the time or support to do your job well? Has your workload ever felt overwhelming and unfair? If so, then this is the episode for you.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Thoughtful Talent Show. I'm Jen Werner of Jen Werner Coaching.
And I'm Chad Ahern of Talent Teams Consulting. And today we're going to talk about strengths and burnout. And Jen, I know that this is a big topic. Why is this so important, and why are we talking about it today?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Everyone's talking about this right now. And it's not anything new. This has been a syndrome of the workplace for over 60 years that people have been studying and researching what's going on with workplaces. In 2019, the World Health Organization actually characterized burnout as a syndrome, not a disease, but a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress. And that hasn't been successfully managed. There's based on some of the research with the Massac burnout inventory, they kind of measure it on 3 dimensions. So those dimensions of burnout, which the WHO uses as well, are feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. You're mentally distant, cynical, angry, and you have negative attitudes towards your job, and a sense of ineffectiveness and a lack of accomplishment. So really, these things are the like symptoms, what we see in others and in ourselves when we have burnout, when we're experiencing burnout. And we know Gallup has done a ton of research around those who feel burnout. Do you want to share those stats with us?
Yeah, so I'll start with Gallup, but that's actually also reinforced by a couple of other organizations I've come
Yeah.
across. So the big one from Gallup is that they found that 28% of workers say that they are burned out either very often or always, particularly at work. That
More than a
is,
quarter.
yeah, that's not good when 1 in 4 people are coming to work feeling already
Always.
exhausted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is there are some other studies. There's one by a research company called iSolved that they published in late last year, December 2023. 72% of employees say burnout is impacting their performance, and 90% of those respondents indicate their poor experience is also impacting the experiences they're providing to their customers.
Yeah.
So it does have a follow-on effect, and that's the reason why we're talking about it. Is it's important not just for the employees, but also for the people that they're serving, whether it's customers or clients. Um, SHRM has also done some research on this, and given that they actually did a fairly, they released some stuff just recently in May of 2024 as part of the Mental Health Month of May. They came out with these key statistics. So 44% of US employees feel burned out at work. It's not surprising. That's similar to Gallup's.
Yep.
45% feel emotionally drained from their work, and 51% feel used up by the end of their workday. So 51% of people are leaving their work and not having any energy for their home life or their friends or community. 2 other things that I'll just mention. I came across another stat. 2/3 of US employees say burnout has gotten worse since the pandemic, and that the annual healthcare spend, at least here in the US, is estimated to be around $125 billion to $190 billion to address basically follow-on effects of burnout. So if you think that this is just like I need to make my employees feel better, it isn't. It has a real financial cost, whether it's to the individuals, the companies they work for, or the greater community. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's massive.
Well, in having that spend, knowing that they're spending that much, this is where Gallup went to what Gallup does. Like, after they asked people if you're feeling burnt out, those that said they're always experiencing burnout or most often experiencing like feelings of burnout at work, they started to dig into those root causes. And I loved this one because they spent some time actually asking, like, if you're feeling burnt out, what do you think those causes might be? And a lot of the things that they were coming up are unfair treatment at work, unmanageable workload, unclear communication. This goes back to that like expectations conversation, lack of manager support, and unreasonable time pressures. And I think since the pandemic, we've all been experiencing some of that, even during the pandemic, as people were, there was less people to do the work that still needed to be done. I don't know that we completely recovered from that. I think we're still pretty lean as far as our, people go. We're still asking our people to do a lot more than what they can handle. This leads into that, like, this isn't an overnight thing. This didn't just all of a sudden happen in 2019, right? Like the WHO had been looking at this for a while, but finally, made a syndrome around it, like classified it as a syndrome, because this is a result of chronic workplace stress. This isn't like, the 2 overnighters you pulled over the whole year. We know this doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, it's definitely a chronic thing. One of the things I just wanted to go back to, something that I've learned relatively recently, and I think goes to that operating kind of lean, is that there's some research out there. I forget if it's from Gallup or from Gartner research, that shows that the number of decisions or initiatives that particularly team leaders who are showing some increased levels of burnout, the number of initiatives or decisions they're needing to make has doubled since 2020. So you have a lean organization, people being asked to do more with less. Is it any wonder why we're talking about these stats of like nearly half the workforce going home feeling exhausted at the end of the day and not having energy for anything else?
Right. And
then
add into that
Yeah.
into that all the change that's happened since 2020, like we talk about that a lot. I think Generation X seems to talk about that a lot. Like, we've had to go from all the different realms of even just watching TV, how TV has changed in our lifetime, how music has changed and buying music has changed in our lifetime. But now put that into the workplace and all of the changes happening in the workplace, the different demands on managers, like you said, and competing priorities from the top down. Really, where should we be focusing our time? And it all leads to that. We're all feeling this pressure.
So just going back to your comment as well about being chronic, that this is something that builds up over time, that this is, you gradually become more and more exhausted. There's no refreshing wheel. And what I find interesting, and one of the things I wanted to bring to this conversation, is that I always find it interesting when companies feel like they can sort of combat or deal with burnout with like an extra Friday off every month, or the half day Fridays, or we're going to have a picnic or the pizza days or whatever. This isn't that doesn't address burnout. Burnout is built up over a long period of time and really does take serious effort to walk back. One of the more common solutions I came across is that they start to think about trying to think about how they've approached similar situations. If you're experiencing burnout, people try and think about, well, how have I handled burnout in the past, and they try and go there, and it's a temporary fix, and then they try and remind themselves, oh, I've gotten over this and succeeded in a similar situation. There's like 84% of people say that. And then they just try and find a friend or somebody to talk to sort of vent and maybe get the load off. And a lot of people go to that. All those stats actually come from Gallup. Another 80% go and do the venting thing.
Yeah.
What they often need to deal with is looking for ways to potentially literally take a vacation from work. There's a big push out there for taking serious rest, taking vacations, that you need to separate from that workload for longer than 24 or 48 hours.
Yeah.
And that they need to be spending more time with family and friends, and just kind of refining the spark a bit. Um,
Right.
so I find it interesting when organizations always sort of spout off, oh well, we to combat our burnout, we do we bring in massage therapists for a day. No, that's
Right.
not it. It's you
I
got
mean,
to
those
really
are great.
work this back.
Yeah, they're really great things. I mean, employees do appreciate it. Those employees that aren't to burnout status yet, they do appreciate, like bringing in a massage therapist, a couple of times a week, or having those like maybe the half days so that you can do some of those more personal things on that like half day off you have. Maybe that's the half day you go and spend with your family, doing something special that you wouldn't normally get to do in your normal workday. The issue with all of those, though, is if you don't have coverage for the people. So, like
Yes.
you said, taking the vacation. I know a lot of people who feel like if they take a vacation, no one's doing their work for them while they're gone. So it just sits and waits, or it piles up, or they work like, and I'm guilty of this, they work extra hours before vacation and extra hours when they get back in order to make up for like what they missed or those things that they were trying to prepare for before they leave, and then all the things they have to catch up on when they get back. It's not having that proper coverage too, that even the vacation time, yes, it helps in the moment and it definitely does give them some relief from that. They might be coming back to even harder things. I think, Chad, the really key piece here is to not get to that level, right?
Right.
So
Right.
we need to catch it early. We need to know our warning signs and maybe even be looking for those warning signs in others. Some of those might be that you're maybe a little easily annoyed. You're quick to anger, your loss of focus. You just can't seem to get focused, maybe indifferent to what's going on, having a harsh tone perhaps with people, back to that like impatience. And some of the work feels transactional. I know for me, in some of the studies I've been working on, I've been really focusing on some of the somatic, so the like body signals of my body, like in the body, somatic symptoms of stress. So that might be, this like feeling of hypervigilant, super anxious, lack of sleep, upset stomach, muscle tension. I know we carry a lot of our stress in our muscles, right?
Yeah.
Even headaches. So, being your own advocate and really standing up for what you need and what you need to do your best, I think is really important. And then understanding what the expectations are for you. Are they realistic? Can you get the work they've given you done in the time you have to give? Do you have competing priorities? And if you do, take that up line, like if you're a manager and you have competing priorities, take that up to your, upline to say, which of these is really important? What should we be focusing on? Because you may take it one way and then have your manager say, oh, well, we really wanted you to focus more on this one, so
Right.
we just, I worked with someone who said, do you want it fast or do you want it right? Because you can't have both. So I think that's, one of those things that we kind of need to come back to too, like understanding what's expected of us, and then being able to like raise your hand and say, this is impossible, or we're going to need some extra help, or what are some different ideas we can do that can get these things done, but maybe not to exactly, that level that we're used to, so that at least we can, touch on every piece.
Yeah. The analogy that struck me as you were talking, Jen, is that we talk about what we have stuff on our plate or off our plate, we hand things off, etc. And
Yeah.
just as an analogy for people to start thinking about this burnout situation, is we've got people that keep trying to expand the size of their plate
Yes.
versus keeping the plate the same. You only have so many work hours, and you only have so many work
Right.
hours, particularly before you start to burn out. So you got to be considerate of that plate size and then right size what you're putting on it. Yes, you can maybe
Yeah.
overstuff on occasion. We always love a
Right.
good Thanksgiving dinner, right? The same thing happens at work. We all have our busy times.
Right.
I worked in higher education for years, and was when I was in admissions, and it became really busy, around acceptance day. and then open houses and so forth. And then when I was in my development work, reunion weekend was always the big thing, always big hands on deck. There's always a little bit more extra to do, or maybe it's the end of the fiscal year. So we're going to have those times, but for the most part, you need to figure out on that plate, what can you move? And if you're being handed another dish, another task, what comes off the plate so that that new thing can then get added. It's not about increasing the size of the plate. And that's where burnout happens. It's trying to construct a new plate to make it bigger. And then you're handling too much. You essentially can't eat it all.
Right.
So I think that
I
you're
love that
right
analogy.
on. Yeah, I
That's
think
really
you're right
good.
on with the body signals too. We get signals that we're too full. We're going to get signals that we're too burned out. that too much is going on here.
That we're approaching that line. And when we start to feel that every day and, over long periods of time, or maybe that even just in the evening, you're not feeling refreshed the next day, you've got some really big warning signs there that you may be leading to it. So like understanding what those are and seeing them in yourself, you can start to combat some of those things. Is it okay if we go into like how strengths might help?
It's funny because I was going to pose you the exact same question, because I was thinking a lot of these symptoms or these feelings I know for myself come out of my having some awareness around my strengths and how they play. So I love your question. If you have some initial thoughts you want to drop, I know I've got a couple things that I wanted to add to the conversation, but what were your thoughts? What were your thinking? What was your thinking about strengths impact here?
Well, so I think a lot of time, while our natural talents and tendencies might work for us to, use our strengths to combat our burnout, they might actually not be the best to diminish burnout or diminish workplace stress. That sometimes it's maybe more important to understand how you've dealt with the stress and pressures in the past, and maybe what works better. I go back to, kind of our activator episode where we talked about sorry about that. We talked about the pause and the pivot, right? So for an example, like an achiever, they may dig in and work harder and longer. They may think that that's what they need to do in order to really get into it. But we might actually be burning ourselves out more than trying to take on more things, trying to do more things with the small amount of time we have. So maybe instead taking a step back, I say this for activator too, taking a step back and thinking through the situation, like really digging deep into like, what are some of the things that I'm going through right now? What is most important? Having that moment to pause, think about the work and then pivot, like, okay, now what is the priority? Empathy, I think, likes to think that maybe we need to think more about how this same thing might affect my my coworkers, my patients, my customers, whoever those might be. And instead, maybe taking a step back and thinking about how you've dealt with a similar situation before, instead of instantly going into how others might feel if they were in this situation. It might actually make more sense to really spend time focusing on what you've done in the past that has worked. Input, I pulled a couple from each of the domains. Input, maybe they keep thinking, they keep digging for more information. I'm not there yet. I need to get more information. And maybe the pause and pivot for them would be to reframe how they might be able to use the information they have. So I know we heard from our great input friends in our last season when we talked about input, that they can just be so happy to keep digging. But if there's a deadline, they could be digging themselves into a little burnout hole, still digging for more information, right? And then my last one is, as an example, would be in communication. We heard from our communication friends a lot of things that people say to them, like land the plane, which I think is not a very nice way to say that. But more words don't always make the information clearer, right? So maybe instead they need to reflect back on ways they've dealt with similar miscommunications in the past. So it might be your communication isn't clear, and how have you overcome some of these miscommunications in the past? So again, it's that like pause and pivot. Yeah.
And
I know you have thoughts too about like actually our talents driving our burnout. Do you want to go into some?
Well, so I want to get there, but I would just like to take a second to highlight, Jen's made some really great points. Jen, you've made some really great points here around how our talents tend to lead us to think, oh, if we just do more of that, then that'll help us
Yeah.
relieve the burnout, whereas it actually drives. We're going to put a link to the resource I'm about to mention in the show notes, but Gallup came out with a great booklet. It's, I think, maybe 15 pages long, really talking about this specific thing of if you have certain executing themes or certain influencing themes, think about reframing, what you've done in the past versus how you could actually do a
Yeah.
better job of addressing your burnout. So I just want to mention that for those
Yeah. I'm glad
that
you did. Thank you.
like me that might have learner input or maybe want to think on a little bit with intellection, um, or activate on it, want to figure out what the
Yeah.
solution is right now. It's a great resource. So I'm just going to say that
Yes.
I did want to get back around to, we've talked a little bit about this being chronic, this being something that doesn't necessarily come out of the blue. A lot of the reasons why it doesn't it sort of builds is that we're likely leaning into our themes maybe a bit too much. Some of our themes could be actually driving the burnout. So I actually started to use myself as an example here, but given that my
Great.
top and themes kind of cover the gamut across all four domains, this is a pretty good run through. So deliberative,
Yeah.
which is an execute thing. Too much thinking around risks can create a negative, vicious cycle of overthinking. So I just I've found myself in situations where I just keep thinking of, oh dear, what's the next risk? Then try to address it. And oh, that's another risk, and then address it. And I burn out a lot of my thinking. And therefore I don't have the thinking to put on some of the more key activities of my business.
It's that
And of
analysis paralysis, right? That you talked about in our deliberative episode. It could lead to
it,
that, which
it, well, so what's interesting here is it's not so much paralysis. It's the literally just thinking one more layer, one
oh
more layer, one more layer. There's not a process. There's a drive to
yeah,
keep addressing risks, and therefore you get that exhaustion. You keep putting the thinking effort to
sure.
to address it. So analysis paralysis definitely comes up. Analytical is right there. It's trying to find one more or better pattern. It's again that's a thinking theme. It has some similarities with deliberative, uh, but it's trying to reevaluate the data one more time. Can we create the next new graph, or if we change the graph we have to a different style, does it tell us something different? And
Yeah.
again, it's just that mental exhaustion. Uh, I
Mhm.
love that you highlighted harmony, empathy before, because I was thinking about my harmony. Trying to balance too many opinions and beliefs. If I'm in a team and everybody's got drastically different feelings, trying to get those all on the same page can lead to a sense of burnout because again, you're trying to put in that effort to try and bring everything together, build that consensus, figure out the most
Yeah.
practical steps for that people will agree on. So, and then I'll just add two others: discipline, not being
Yeah.
flexible, maybe taking that time
Sure.
away. If you're scheduled to work, until 4 or 4:30 on every day, and yet you're kind of exhausted by the 3:30 mark, maybe that's a sign you need to go get some rest, or change up the
Mhm.
schedule a little bit, spend some time away from work or with family. So
Yeah.
there's that, and then also individualization, which happens to be my number 9. It's one of the stronger relationship building themes I have. Um, but trying to personalize everything. Um,
Yeah.
I've caught myself doing this when sometimes I'm trying to come up with a solution for some of the team clients I work with. Trying to personalize it right down to their team, and yet if I took a second and looked and be like, hey, I've got enough similarities with this other team I've worked with that it's a good enough solution, and it will
Yeah.
get them where they need to be. It's not that I'm trying to shortchange that team, but trying to go that one extra step. Again, it brings on that exhaustion piece
Yeah.
of just so much effort.
That overworked talents then, right?
Overworked, right, right,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's just
Yeah.
so those of you listening to this and thinking, God's, burning himself out. Don't worry, I've become better at managing it. And it's also one of the things I try and help the teams and leaders that I work with try and manage of, like,
Yeah.
are you burning yourself out trying to lean into your talents too much or over the mark of where you should have kind of said this is good enough?
Oh, Chad, I
So
love that you brought that to the personal place, using your own talents, because I definitely have felt that the same with my achiever. And when I'm overwhelmed, feeling so overwhelmed, and I have too many things to do, so many times I just keep doing that. Like, I'm not going to have lunch today. I'll just barrel through. I'm not going to stop for dinner. I'll just keep barreling through. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. It's okay. I can just keep going. And it does not help. Like,
no.
I end up having to do work over again or find mistakes later because I wasn't taking the moment to, like, take that step back, think about what I'm doing, so our own talents can lead us so easily to burn ourselves out when we're using them too strongly. And so just understanding that delicate balance, that double-edged sword that we talked about all throughout episode 1 or season 1, through every talent, we talked about that double-edged sword. Like, we have that potential to do that to ourselves. I think it's also good to know that while they have the potential to burn us out, they can also burn out others that we lead. So,
Yeah.
as a manager, if you're thinking about your talents and, how might some of your talents be inadvertently leading to others' burnout? So I had a couple examples I was going to share too. So going back
Yeah.
to that achiever one, I like to pick on achiever because it's my number 2. I'm always going to pick on it. So your pace, while it might be good for you, might lead others to feel like they need to try to keep up. Like, maybe even
Yeah.
answering emails that you send at 9 p.m. Maybe that's the time that you work best. It doesn't mean that you expect, and you should not expect, everyone else to be on and answering emails at 9 p.m. if that's not their normal work time.
Yeah.
Discipline, I think, is another good one. And I'm glad you highlighted it too, because while your process and trying to make sure you have the right process in place may burn you out individually, you could be looking at burning out your team if your process is so rigid and you're focusing on how the work is getting done and not what is getting done. So I think that's another one of those high in discipline. They can be so hyper focused on the how that they're not really looking at the final, the end goal,
Yeah.
the what is being created. I added communication back in here again too, because I like to pick on communication. That you may be sharing stories that you think explain your expectations, but losing your audience. I've heard this a lot from those with communication, where
Yeah.
they know that they're giving lots of words and lots of stories, but that story might not translate to the listener. If they haven't gone through what you're experiencing in that story, they might not be clear on that. So having clear and concise communication is better sometimes than more words. 2 more. Command, your directness, while kind of that double-edged sword to the communication, your directness and your to the point may come off as harsh, leaving no space for your listener to feel like they're okay to ask questions and get clarity on what you've given. It's more of a direct command. Positivity. Oh, this one's a tough one too, because we always want people to be positive and lead with positive intent. But sometimes if you're too positive, you're maybe diminishing the feelings of others. You're not leaving the space open for people to validate others' feelings if they're feeling more on the negative side. So
Yeah.
while we want you to keep a positive outlook on things, it's also important to listen to where the other person is. So if you're just leading with puppies and rainbows and, like the happy, we want to think happy thoughts, put happy thoughts out there into the world, you might be diminishing some real risks that others feel and want to share with you. So
Yeah.
those are kind of where I was going with those.
Yeah. First of all, fantastic examples. I think you're spot
Thanks.
on that leaders really do need to think about how their themes
Yeah.
are impacting those that they lead. We talk a lot about, and I know that we've got a whole separate episode, maybe even a series of episodes talking about the 4 needs of followers that are going to be coming up later this
Yeah.
season. But one of the other things that struck me as you were talking is that there's a balancing act. You talked about the double-edged sword. and I was reflecting on my own comments. I wanted to clarify something a little bit, and your
Yeah.
double-edged sword made me think of this, is that there's a difference between finding the best application of your themes and finding moments of flow, which does not necessarily
Right.
lead into burnout, because that feels almost effortless, not effortful.
Yes.
It's effortless. And so if you can get your talents in the right sort of measure on the dial, you don't want them burning too hot. You don't want to, turn them off and not have them contribute at all. But just for leaders that are listening to this, know that there is an appropriate balance. It's what Jen and I do as coaches. We help leaders and team
Yeah.
members find that balance, because you want people finding moments of flow where it may seem like, it could be hours go by and it feels like 15 minutes. That's effortless.
Right.
Okay. What we're talking about here is when themes get away from, the people that we coach or even ourselves, and we crank them too hard and too much effort. We're basically trying to slam the gas on a car that's got the emergency brake pulled. You are going to burn out something in the engine or the brakes
Right.
or any of the other mechanisms. So the same thing happens with us internally, is we are going to push against something that's resisting. And that's where the balance comes in. So I wanted to bring that in because I think you and I have kind of navigated around that topic, and I just want to be
Mm-hmm.
really clear for those, especially those that are just getting to know their talents and their strengths, is that it is a balancing act. And that's why an external coach like Jen and I, not to plug us, but it is what we do. And that's why we're talking about this topic. Is this burnout, as we highlight at the top, is so important right now. A lot of this is being driven by our themes and the leaders with certain themes. We need to then turn around and address it. And so
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we're differentiating between flow and effortful or over effort, which leads to exhaustion.
Oh, Chad, I'm so glad you brought the flow into it, because that got me into those moments where I was thinking about my achiever, and when my achiever's in flow, sometimes I can work right through lunch and not realize it.
Right.
I'm so like hyper focused and I'm in the zone and moving along but that feels good. That's
Right.
different than that like heavy weight, the muscle tension in your shoulders, like just like kind of curling into yourself. But some of those
Yeah.
physical symptoms you can see, that looks completely different than the flow feeling where you're just chugging along and getting things done. So
Yeah.
checking off that to-do list
Yes. Yeah.
as the achiever. Oh,
Yeah.
I love
So
this. So we're going great in this, like what managers can do differently.
yeah. So I was going to ask, did you want to add anything else to your comments about what leaders could or should be considering? I know you talked about starting to be aware of their themes. Was there something else you want to add
Yeah.
there?
Um, I think maybe just can I provide some stats, because I had a few
Oh,
stats about
yeah.
managers and leaders. So it's the number one leaders, like leaving your manager, escape a bad job, a bad manager, a bad leader. It's the number 3 reason people leave their job. Yikes. And so I think that, like how might your own workplace stress as a leader be leading to stress for those that you manage? So I wanted to dig deeper into that, like management side of it, because while we're like putting so much more on the managers, they're also 30% report more often burnt out. Only 31% of managers, according to Gallup's recent data, only 31% of managers are actually feeling engaged, and managers are 55% more likely to leave their organization. I feel like these are like horrible statistics for why it's so important to support your managers too. Like, so if we have leaders listening, even those subordinates for the managers, like it's so important to support our managers and understanding all the different things that they have going on, because they are the ones who are really getting burned out too. Like these stats about the managers and these specific stats about the managers are actually worse than individual contributors and worse than leaders. So we see that managers are the ones who are really getting the squeeze on this burnout the most.
Yeah. No, it's again, I love the data. I think it's really important to highlight that the people managers, so the kind of the mid, first, second tier
Yeah.
people managers are really the ones kind of squeezed. They've got the C-suite type leaders organizational leaders that are kind of pushing down a lot of demands, then they're
Yeah.
trying to manage everything. I mentioned earlier in the episode about the drastic increase, the twofold increase in decisions and initiatives that they're leading. So yeah, I think it's really important, and that kind of leads me to a couple of points I wanted to make. When I
Yeah.
think about what leaders should be doing, what leaders could or should be doing differently, I first think about for themselves, really take a look at how your own talents intersect with burnout. Going back to what we just
Mhm.
talked about, what themes are running maybe a little too hot, or you're pushing against a little too hard, and it's taking you out of those moments of flow. It's leading you to that exhaustion place. And then, you know, taking that awareness and then kind of flipping it, considering not leaning into your natural talents quite as much,
Yeah.
like what we are just talking about, sort of find a different way to think about them and apply them. And that's where that Gallup resource um, that I
Right.
mentioned would be really helpful. I also think this goes back to that sort of plate analogy that we were talking about before. Get clear on your own key efforts and what you can cut out. Are there things that need to be
Yeah.
delegated off your plate so that you don't feel like you have to keep building the plate, or putting stuff around it that's still trying to address yourself? How can you delegate, or how can you clarify with some
Yeah.
of those upper level leaders of what the true priorities and expectations are? And that goes back to something you mentioned before about setting the right expectations. That's for managers as well as for the individual contributors. So leaders really need to get clear on what they're doing. I think for their teams, the leaders, as we were talking about, sort of set the pace, set the tone. They need to be aware of their own talent themes and how they impact those. But check your thinking and encourage proactive rest. So one of the other stats I found as
Yeah.
I was prepping for this is that there's a survey done by Gartner, said 72% of HR leaders surveyed believed that their highest performing employees work longer hours. And the research actually shows the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Simply put, they quoted this gentleman, Brent Cassell, who's with Gartner's HR practice. He says, simply put, more hours worked does not equal more results. Instead, organizations must rethink how they approach rest. Rest should be embedded into the workflow to prevent burnout. So again, I know you talked about making sure there's the coverage, but that's where a leader can really think about, okay, we're going to make rest or having vacation time a priority for not only them as leader, but for everybody on the team. So you need to figure out a better coverage method, so that people can actually get that proactive rest. I think another thing that leaders should think about is taking that time away from work. What I'm talking about in terms of rest is actually making sure people aren't working long hours. I think you can
Mm-hmm.
expand that to also think about how are you making sure people have time away from the office. And then it all comes back to really looking at the workloads of your team. Are there activities that people are doing simply out of habit? We've done this for 10 years. We're just going to keep on doing it. We've generated this report and it takes me 6 hours, yet nobody reads it, but I still generate it because that's what was called upon when I first started the organization. Let's
Mm-hmm.
relook at that. Is there stuff that can come off because it's obsolete? And then really looking for what the new impactful work is and right sizing those two parts of the equation.
Oh, Chad, I
So
really love the like proactive rest piece and talking about that. I think there is something too that, we've spent so much time as a country, as, just employees in general. There's been this, the hardest worker is the best worker, the one that's like they're the longest, burning the candle on both ends, like they're the ones who are like lifted up, like they're, carrying the whole company on their shoulders. And I've seen that be the opposite. The people who are working the longest, who are there in first thing in the morning and they're at the end of the day and everybody else is gone for the day. Like I've seen people work part-time and be much more efficient than the person who's there, night and day. So it really does come down to, as a manager and as a leader, like we really need to be focusing on what ways our people work best. So like knowing your own science, knowing your own weak spots, knowing how your strengths can burn you out, where you're coming, up against some of these things that we talked about today. I think it's just really important to not think just because you're working more doesn't mean you're working smart, right? Smarter, not harder. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also a value of modeling that's in there too.
Yes.
I've worked for leaders across a bunch of different teams, and I coach certain leaders. They think that, oh, I'll just work super long so my team doesn't have to. Well, that
Yeah.
doesn't set the right precedent. It doesn't set the right model. You're not
No.
showing your team members what you truly value, um, and then they feel bad that they don't want to put it all on their leader, so that then they try and model the same thing, and it just becomes a very vicious cycle for everybody. Everybody ends up with all these stats around exhaustion and burnout and not feeling
Right.
happy and wanting to leave their job and so forth. So I really
Yeah.
think that there's a massive part here where leaders really need to think about, what are you modeling and what is actually going to get you and your team out of the burnout zone, um,
Yeah.
and back into a place where you're efficiently, constructively, and appropriately, and in a healthy way contributing to your organization's success.
So I have like one final like kind of thought about this before we wrap too. So you're bringing me back to my days where I did that. I would come in early before everybody got there, and I would stay late after everyone else left. What I found in those moments, though, first thing in the morning and at the end of the day, were when I got the best and the most work done. I was most productive in those moments, and all the other time in between was putting out fires. I didn't get to actually focus on anything I needed to take care of because I was too busy for, putting out the fires. So we're going to talk about this in future episodes, maybe back to some of those like blenders and splitters, how we work best, the place around maybe even some of the hybrid workplace conversation that we listened to a lot over the summit. But I think it's understanding how you work best and where you work best, understanding what you look like when you're in flow versus what you look like when you're overwhelmed, and really paying attention to those physical symptoms, that maybe even your shortness, your irritable tone with others, like picking up on some of that quicker so that you can stop yourself before you get to that level of burnout.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. As we wrap up this episode,
Yeah.
were there any specific things that you'd love to maybe recall out or re-highlight again? I know I have a couple. I just want to go back to it
Yeah.
and highlight.
I think really, really, Chad, it's that spending the time to know yourself, reducing this. It's easier to reduce your level of burnout or your level of exhaustion before you get there. So catch it early, spend the time to understand what you look like when you're working your best, so that you
Yeah.
know what that threshold is and where you need to maybe do some pause and pivot. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, and I would just go back to, and it kind of goes right in line with that of what's the size of your plate. That was an analogy I kind of came up with on the fly, but I think it's a really
I like it.
accurate one for a lot of leaders right now. The doubling of niches and decisions over the last few years has led people to push their plates bigger than they can actually handle, and right sizing that and making sure you have the right balance of work and expectations on that plate is going to be a place that is going to help with um, addressing it early, or finding it early and addressing it.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing is, just especially for leaders, I really would call on any leaders who are listening to this, really think about how your talent themes are impacting or being perceived by your team, and whether
Yeah.
those are inadvertently pushing others to burnout. I loved your example of the achiever sort of running super hard, super fast, and people trying to keep up with that pace. I
Mm-hmm.
know myself as a thinker, I don't keep up real well with hard
Right.
charging achievers. I love what they do, but sometimes I don't feel like it can sustain that pace all the
Yep.
time. And so I think for leaders, having that awareness is going to serve your team that much more, in keeping them out of that burnout zone. So The last thing I'm actually going to,
for themselves and their team. Yeah.
yes. And because I'm a data guy, I also want to go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning, which is the World Health Organization and the Maslow burnout inventory. There is a way to measure this. Leaders, take some time to actually, collect some data on exactly how burned out are your people, and then take appropriate action. If they're all fine, great. If not, do something quickly, because the longer they stay out in a burnout zone, the greater the increase in the chance that they're going to leave for another organization. So that would be my final call out to leaders and my closing thoughts on this. So with that said, I'm going to simply wrap up by saying I'm going to keep encouraging all our leaders and all our individual contributors to keep playing to your strengths.
And as always, be uniquely you.
If you like this episode, we encourage you to like, follow, and subscribe to wherever you find your podcasts.